Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carl Chesser, and welcome to an edition of our CERN Tech Talk series. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Katharina Probst. Katharina is currently a senior engineer manager at Google, where she leads teams that span over 90 people and across the globe, building infrastructure and support Google Cloud Platform, including the Google Compute Engine, Cloud, and other services. In this world of virtual work, she has learned several lessons on how to scale and work effectively with her teams. This includes managing effective communication for work that spans across multiple organizations at Google. I've had the pleasure of hearing Katharina speak at QCon San Francisco last year, and I'm very excited that she's able to join us today. In her talk, she'll be sharing about ownership in high-performing teams and what it means to act like an owner. While Katharina presents, you can submit questions for our Q&A section at the end. And with that, welcome, Katharina. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you all for joining us. And thank you definitely for giving me the opportunity to talk here in this forum. This is a topic that is top of mind for me a lot, especially in the last few months, as we're all living through a pandemic. And the lessons that I am learning together with my team, I'm very happy to share them. I don't consider myself as knowing all the answers here. So what I'm hoping is that the lessons that I'm learning will be useful for you as well. And then you can apply them to your scenario, and then, share back with us and with other folks about the lessons that you've learned. So with that, let's get started. I spend a lot of time working on systems, distributed systems, and the classic incident that you see a lot is something like this. A customer tries to get to a website or a service, or a client tries to get to a service, and it's just not working. And you, as the customer, have no idea why it's not working. All you know is that it's not working. So the same thing in reality often applies to our human systems. And one of the insights that has really helped me kind of have a mental image of how to think about this space is that the lessons that we are learning in distributed computer systems can actually also apply to human systems. Human systems are immensely complex, and a lot of the lessons that we're learning in computer systems can actually help us deal better with the complexity that we're dealing with when we have human systems. So this is my personal email inbox. And as you can see, there's a lot going on here. I have several folders here on the left with the number of unread emails exceeding like 90,000 or 100,000, and I don't think I'm ever going to get to read them. You see here on the top right, I have my inbox split up into several types of categories, and I have several new updates. I have somebody's trying to reach me personally via chat at the bottom right. I have some reminders from Gmail itself, helpfully saying you received an email 5 days ago and didn't respond. And then finally, you can also see here sort of towards the top left, a starred email, which is one of the systems that I use for myself to try to keep track of stuff. I don't know, but I know a lot of people whose inboxes look like this. And this is kind of a failure state, right? So in this case, it's very difficult for me to even get my head around all the things that I should be doing and in what priority. So this was kind of my starting point in thinking about this. Human systems, the reason that my inbox looks like this is because my work inbox looks similar, is because I work with a lot of different people, and our systems, our human systems, are incredibly complex. Our organizations are incredibly complex, and that leads to essentially a combinatorial blow up of this complexity. So we will dive into both of these, but they really tie in together. So thank you. I was already introduced. Just to remind you, my name is Katharina Probst. I go by Katharina. Here's a link where you can find me on LinkedIn if you want to find me later. So let's think about how we can talk about ownership and what it means to act like an owner and act as a high functioning team and organization. The easiest way for me conceptually to think about this is to break it down into individual ownership and then slowly build up from there to team level ownership and finally to org level ownership. And the kinds of questions and answers that you have in each of these categories are different, but as I alluded to in my introduction, they actually tie in pretty nicely with each other, as we will see. Let's first spend some time talking about individual ownership. Now, with individual ownership, I again draw the analogy of what do systems expect from each other, right? So if you have a distributed system, if you have one piece of software calling another piece, or it might be even a method calling another method, or a customer calling up a website, there are some pretty clear expectations, right? And one of those expectations is what I would call clean APIs. So there are very clear expectations set about you give me this and I give you an answer back, right? Here are the inputs that I need. Here's the kind of answer that you can expect from me. And so what that means is that the system, such a system, will also articulate what it can and cannot do. That's really what this means, right? It also means that if I call a website or if I try to load a website, or if I have a system that calls another system, I, as the caller, shouldn't have to worry about everything that goes on behind the scenes, everything else that needs to be called, all the other systems that need to be called in order to gather the information necessary to give me my answer. And what that means is that it's the responsibility of that system to get what it needs from its downstream systems. Another clear expectation is when I have a computer system that calls another system, it needs to communicate status to me, right? It needs to let me know what its status is, whether it can do what I expect it to do or whether it cannot. And if it cannot, what I should do next. And then finally, ideally, I don't want to sit around and wait for a very long time only for the system to finally get back to me and say, sorry, I can't help you, right? This is what we see a lot. So we see a lot of timeouts, for instance, in computer systems. We really prefer to have systems that fail fast and let the caller know it didn't work out. Please try again. So when you think about people and individual ownership, if you want to act like an owner on behalf of your company, if you want to own your job and your responsibilities, the expectations are actually quite similar when you interact with other people, right? You need to communicate what you can and cannot do. You should clearly communicate what what your status is, and ideally you wouldn't let people wait. So we'll dive into all of these concepts a little bit more. So when we talk about people, what it means, again, I should be able to articulate what my role and my responsibility is. And it is also my responsibility that if you come to me with a request, then it's on me to do the legwork and to work with other teams and other systems or whatever it is that I need to give you that answer. You shouldn't have to worry about every single interaction that I will have with my downstream systems or downstream teams or partners or whatever it may be. Similarly, I should be able to communicate to you clearly, if I cannot help you, where should you go next? What should you do? Or what's the problem, right? And then finally, one of the things that I try to do very, very much is, if I cannot help you, I want to let you know as quickly as possible so that you can take the next step necessary. One of the things that, and I'll mention this perhaps again later, but one of the things that happens to me sometimes is that somebody sends me a request or an email, something that requires my response, and I time out, right? Like I don't get back to them quickly enough. And that is really something that I try to avoid. Now, let's Go back to my email inbox. If I'm in this scenario and I'm basically in a failure mode, I'm on the defensive, I cannot react fast enough, I cannot get on top of everything that I need to be doing, and I'm at risk of falling short on these responsibilities that I just outlined. So what do? Some days, some days really how I feel. I feel like, oh my gosh, the way I actually call it is I'm DDoSed, right? Like there are so many requests coming in, I cannot figure out what to do next, or I don't even know what I should be working on. But I actually take my responsibility to my coworkers very seriously as an owner of my work and my responsibilities. So I personally constantly strive to do better, and I also encourage my team to take this very seriously. What does this mean? Let's dive into these areas a little bit more. Again, clean APIs. What does this mean for my own personal responsibilities? I have to be able to articulate what are my focus areas? What am I working on right now? And then perhaps this is a more difficult question to answer. What am I not working on? Why am I saying no to your request? And these two last points that you're seeing here at the bottom left, they're actually really critical. I just had a meeting this morning where some team was falling behind on their deliverables, right? This happens sometimes, but as we were diving into it, it's pretty clear that it's actually very difficult to say no sometimes, right? We want to help. We want to be the person that helps out another team. We want to be we don't want to be the long pole for any project. And that's wonderful and that's great. And it means we take our job seriously. But we also have to consider the flip side, which is if we say yes now, but then cannot deliver, that's actually probably worse than if we communicate upfront that we cannot do it. And so then the corollary of what I just said is if I say I'm going to do something, then it is my responsibility to get it done, even if it means rallying other teams to do it, right? Rarely anything I do in isolation, or any of my team's projects, they're rarely in isolation. So oftentimes what it means is we rally other teams to get their pieces done and their pieces of the puzzle done, so we can finish the entire puzzle and then hand it back as something that we are accountable for. And so that's what I try to do when it comes to individual things as well. If somebody asks me a question, I want to make sure I do everything behind the scenes. The other aspect of this is clearly communicating status. And here is where I go back again to my little analogy with computer systems. If two systems talk to each other, they send status codes between each other. So one type of status code is this HTTP status code, and the most common status code, hopefully, is 200 OK, right? And this is what we would like that I strive for sure, is that somebody asks me a question, they get their answer, right? If my colleague comes to me and says, can you help me figure out why X is failing? I will have the answer for them, right? So this is sort of the ideal state and perhaps the easiest state, right? However, in reality, again, if you look at my email inbox, sometimes what happens is that my colleague comes to me and says, or my colleague sends me an email and says, can you help me figure out why X is failing? And now that email goes into a large pile of other emails from other people. And then my colleague doesn't hear anything back from me for a while. So they're sitting there wondering, right? They don't really know what's going on. So they're sitting there wondering, and there's scenario one, which is I'm working on it. Maybe there's a lot of legwork I need to do. Maybe I need to look at some system and some dashboard, need to talk to somebody else, some other team, schedule a meeting. It could be a lot of legwork that I'm doing in the background, right? My colleague doesn't know any of this because I haven't communicated any status back. The other option, the other scenario is perhaps more likely, which is that my colleague has come to me with a question, and so have 6 or 12 other people. right? So it's in the list somewhere, it's in the queue, but none of these people know which one I'm prioritizing, what work I'm prioritizing, when I will get back to them, and if they have any hope of trying, of getting their response. So what do? I time out and they come back and they say, so what's going on with this? Can you help me figure out why this is failing? And this is the failure mode that I alluded to earlier today. And this actually, it does sometimes happen, and I call it out every time it happens. I say to my colleagues, I'm sorry, this timed out. This is not my intention. I want to set clear expectations and clear ETAs, so that they know what to do next. Why? Not only because I want to try to be nice to them, but if you think about this from an ownership perspective, right? What is it that's good for the company in this case, right? What's good for the company is that my colleague knows whether or not I can help them. And if I cannot, they will go somewhere else, right? And things will keep moving forward. Whereas if I just sit on it and nothing happens, that holds everything back, right? And then it's much harder for us as a team and as an organization to make forward progress. So I like to think of this again, not just from I want to be a nice person and not make people wait for me perspective, but also from an ownership perspective of I own my piece of responsibility, and I owe it to my colleagues and to the company to hold up my end of the bargain and communicate what I can do. So if I don't do this, everybody retries, right? And it just gets worse. Just like in systems, I almost get a retry storm, right? Everybody's asking me again. And here I am sitting and it's just getting worse, just like for a system it would. And I need to struggle to get myself out of that. And sometimes catch on fire. So how do I get out of this? And so here are some of the lessons that I've learned and some of my goals. As you see here in the footnote, I'm nowhere near perfect on all of them, but this is something I'm trying to continuously improve. Right? So if somebody sends me something, I get back to them, or I do my very best to get back to them and say, okay, I can do it, but I cannot do it right now, and you will get it by the end of the week. Is that good enough? And so this is something I try to be very explicit about. And you'd be surprised, I would recommend this if you've never tried it, you'd be surprised how powerful that is. Because oftentimes people say, yes, next week is fine, 2 weeks is fine, but it's much better than them just sitting there and not knowing what's going to happen. And then, of course, the important thing is that you actually then follow up and do it by the end of the week or whenever you committed to it. The last thing I want to touch on here is failing fast. So failing fast is, I guess, also a corollary of what we were just talking about. If somebody comes to me and asks for my help, as I already mentioned, it's really more important and it's better for the company if I just say I cannot do it, rather than say, okay, let me try, maybe, probably not, but maybe I'll get to it next week. And then I can't, right? We have so many things pulling on us for attention. It's really important that we communicate clearly when we can't do something. Again, this is something I strive to do, and I don't always succeed, but it's something that I think is a very powerful technique. One of the things that I do is I try to look at the requests that are coming in for me. And then what I try to avoid is, like we said, a timeout. And then I finally get to it. And then I turn around and say, so I'm actually not the right person to talk to. So to me, that's kind of the worst case scenario for my own personal ownership. Because not only did I make my colleague wait, but I basically reset them to zero after all this waiting and this retry. So that is really, again, what I try to avoid and what I actually also, expect from my team that we avoid as much as possible. So how do you avoid these failure modes? If you're like me, you have a lot of requests coming in, a lot of things pulling on your time. Um, but I want to be the kind of person that owns up to their responsibilities and takes them seriously. So one of the things I always try to do, which again is a good best practice in systems, but applies to this scenario as well, is make sure you're not the only one who can do something, right? If you're the only one who can do something and you're out on vacation, then nothing happens, right? And this is a problem, and it discourages people from going on vacation, and lots of other bad things happen. So this isn't always possible, don't get me wrong, but finding delegates, finding other people on the team who can do something is actually a really good thing to strive for. As I already said, don't always say yes. It's actually really hard to say no for many of us. But the reality of it is, if there are too many burning issues, none of them really are burning because nothing, moves forward. So being very thoughtful about which areas we pick and which areas we do not, as much as humanly possible, is a good thing. And then finally, have a system. This is something that's very important to me and that has really helped me lately. Not let things fall through the cracks. So let's dive into this a little bit more. No single point of failure. Again, scale horizontally. Make sure that other people know how to answer questions. Make sure that you delegate, say approvals if you're in a leadership position. When, right? Don't always say yes. So say, the the one way that I think about this, again, going back to my distributed systems background, is think about what your current load is, and adjust based on that, and that's okay, right? Like you can say, right now I'm not maxed out, I can take this on, and it's okay for the same kind of request to say 2 weeks later, it's just not going to happen this week. It cannot, right? And then finally, having a system that works for you. This is, I cannot stress this more. I cannot stress this enough. I talk with my team about this all the time. And the reason I talk with my team about this is because after years of searching, I have finally stumbled on a system that works for me. It involves lots of emails that I send to myself with this scheduled send feature that are essentially reminders. Trust me, it's not the only system and it doesn't work for everybody. But the goal is to find a system that works for you and makes technology work for you so that you don't have to keep track of everything. It's impossible to keep track of everything for many of us. And so just having systems that I tried in the past where I said, okay, everything that I need to do, I'm going to copy over to a to-do list. And then I'm going to go every day over my to-do list or something. It never quite scaled. It never quite worked for me. So the message that I really want to send here is just don't give up. Keep looking for a system that works for you and makes technology work for you so that things just come to you and rather than you having to, add overhead and add even more work to your plates. This has really helped me act more like I said, like an owner. And my team and others have commented for sure that things keep popping up, and I don't let them fall through the cracks. And I almost feel like so. With this, I kind of want to lead into the next sections, and one of the things, everything I've described so far is sort of describing reactive work, or it comes across as describing reactive work. But it doesn't have to be. So everything that we described here applies to proactive work as well, right? Very concretely and very tactically. I put on my to-do list, which is a scheduled send email, things that I need to think about, right? And then they're on my list and they will get attention, right? And I need to think ahead, need to think about, what are the projects we're going to work on? What are our roadmaps? Those sorts of things. How do we make sure we set ourselves up for less and less reactive work and more proactive work? Now, I said at the very beginning of my talk that I like to think of this space as, building up from the individual level, team level, org level. And now it's time to talk a little bit about team ownership. But really, there isn't that much difference between individual ownership and team ownership. Ideally, teams act just like individuals do, but at a team basis. And I know this is completely oversimplifying the problem, but one mental leap that I try to make is between individual and team is I want to be the kind of teammate, I want to be in a work group. I want to pick up the slack to make the team successful, right? This, you may think now, is in contrast to what I said earlier, which is you say no to things when you need to, all of these things. But essentially, it's generalizing that concept to the team level, right? So the team should be very thoughtful about what the team takes on based on the capacity. The team should strive to, help each other to accomplish the team goals and so forth. I have seen teams work incredibly well together, and it's you. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this, but it is absolutely incredible what a team can accomplish together if they're a high functioning team that works together to accomplish things, rather than everybody kind of being off on their own with their own goals. So it's really important to apply all of these concepts about ownership to the team level as well. And it's important for us as leaders, team leads, or technical team leads, whatever the case may be, to keep reinforcing that it's actually really important that we contribute to the team and what the team can together accomplish. I want to spend a little bit of time, or maybe a little bit more than a little bit of time, talking about org level ownership, because this is something that I think is a missing piece otherwise in this thinking, and also because it's something that is on my mind a lot and maybe applies to many of you as well. So org level ownership is a little bit different. Why is it different? Because if you're leading a project in a large organization, you don't control everything, everybody's time, everything. There are so many different unknowns and complex human systems that I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, that we have to approach this a little bit differently. So let's talk about a hypothetical scenario. Congratulations, you were just put in charge of leading a very important cross-org project, right? This project involves many teams, as we will see, and now we have to figure out, how do you lead this project, right? Or you and your leadership have to figure out, how do you lead this project? So there are two basic approaches that I've seen. One approach is, great, we have a high impact cross-org project. Let's do a reorg and have everybody report to you. That's approach number one. Approach number two is you say, congratulations, go, figure it out, right? And you have to lead this effort across all of these teams and across reporting chains. Now, each one of these has advantages and disadvantages. And I would say it probably depends a bit on the culture also, which one would work better. If you take the first approach, it's simpler in some sense. You can lead by authority, which can also be a disadvantage, though. It also has the disadvantage that more and more we see all of these projects that, at least in my experience, in the roles that I've been in, there are many projects that involve many teams across the organization, and sometimes even outside of the organization, customers or partners. So one disadvantage is you can't always just reorg to make it a simple work structure. Whereas with the second approach, it is the flip side of that, of course, it's definitely more flexible. It can be applied to any project. You can have multiple projects running in parallel that span many teams. It doesn't actually preclude a reorg later if that is deemed to be the correct choice. And one of the things that I'm, reading in the literature and certainly experiencing myself is the kinds of cross-functional leadership skills are super critical. I see this over and over, and kind of honing these skills is something that is very helpful for people over and over and over again. On the flip side, you have to lead by influence, and that is actually those cross-functional leadership skills. And there are some risks with this approach, as we will see. The risks essentially come down to possibly diffused ownership. But let's talk about this a little bit more. So let's say in this hypothetical scenario, you are the green box in the middle here, and that's you. You're somewhere in your org chart, right? So there are many different parts of the org, and this is obviously a hypothetical org chart, and maybe for you all this looks very different, but just imagine you're somewhere in this org, and you are now in charge of this project. And as best you can tell, although you may not know everything right now, as best you can tell, all the boxes in green, all the teams in yellow need to be involved in this project. So that sounds like an interesting challenge. And when I say be involved in this project, that could mean anything, but it could definitely mean that each of these teams need to develop and deliver things that are critical to the project and will be blockers for the delivery of the project. So the first step is figure out who you need to be working with. And then as you get into this, if your experience is like mine, you'll find out, this wasn't actually the exhaustive list. Maybe all the boxes in pink also need to be involved. And so, it gets more complicated. So if you keep this org chart, whether it's with the pink ones or without, this gives you so much flexibility, right? It is difficult to lead in this scenario, but it gives you a lot of flexibility because whether or not these pink teams, maybe they just need to be involved for a short time and deliver something, and then they can phase out again and move on to other projects. So this kind of flexibility in an organization gives us a lot of, it's very powerful. And then if you succeed, there's always the next project, right? So maybe in the next project, this new set of yellow teams need to be involved. And as I said before, if you have figured out how to lead a team in those circumstances, then you can apply it again. So maybe I've convinced you, maybe not. Hopefully I've given you some things to think about, but you're probably sitting there saying, that sounds really complicated. If you've never done this before, how in the world do you do this, right? Like, who's the owner? What does it even mean for me to be an owner? Like the green box in the middle. How do I act like an owner on behalf of the company if I can't tell anybody what to do because most of these people don't report to me and some of them are more senior than me? So I think the best analogy that I've come up with, which I know is mixing metaphors from earlier in the analogy that I sometimes tell people is like, think about being a homeowner. If you own a home and something breaks in your home, you also don't control everything, right? Like if the water heater breaks, you probably, if you're like me, you don't know how to build a water heater, a new one, so you will have to find somebody to fix it or bring you a new one and install it, right? You may not have control over those people's schedules. You may not have control over, like full control over the quality of their work. And yet, you will probably get it done because you're going to want to take a warm shower at some point. So this is kind of how I think about this. It's not that you can control everything. It's not that you fully understand necessarily everything that needs to go into fixing this system, in this case, a water heater, but you're still accountable, right? In this case, you're accountable to yourself, to your family. But in our case of the hypothetical scenario where you're leading a team cross-functionally, it's really the same thing. You're still accountable. Like if something breaks over there somewhere deep down, and I'm the owner of this project, I'm still accountable. I need to make sure that I understand what the blockers are, I understand the path forward, and so forth. One of the failure modes that I've seen in this scenario is that somebody says, okay, I'm the person in the green box, so I'm in charge of this huge cross-functional project, everything goes through me because I'm accountable and everything goes through me. I approve everything. That doesn't scale and it doesn't really work. And at least not in the cases that I've seen, and in part because many of these underlying systems are so complex that no one person can understand everything about them. And so it's actually quite important that that we don't have everything going through that one person. The other negative side effect of having everything go through one person is that people feel alienated. People feel marginalized, and they're like, I'm not part of the decision-making process. I feel like everything is just handed down by people that I don't even report to, and it, perspective, it does not work out well. And then again, if you think like an owner and you're accountable, you want to make this project a success. You want to make this project a success not only for yourself but for the company. It's actually really important to make sure that we hear all of these ideas and build this kind of inclusive environment. So I want to just make one point, which is that the kinds of expectations that we have when we talk at an org level are in some sense similar to what we were talking about individual ownership. And that's why I draw this parallel here in terms of expectations. So we'll go through those again, just to kind of, bring the point home of this parallelism. So in our org case, what does it mean to have clean APIs? Well, things get pretty messy pretty quickly. If you're in a situation where you have a distributed team, maybe they're all working from home right now, in different parts of the world and in different parts of the org, and not all of them are bought in. That's really a risk. That's a big risk that I see. That's something that is really worth paying attention to make sure that you as the owner communicate very clearly, here's what we do, here's what we don't do, and here's what we all agree to. So writing these things down is actually quite important in my experience. And then this leads me into really understanding what are the dependencies, what are the blockers, what are the risks, what are the long poles. So basically managing this project in a way that everybody has clear insight into where we are, what the risks are, and what we need to be worried about next. And then the next thing that goes along with this is, if we do have something that needs to be escalated because two different teams, like one here, they don't agree, who do they escalate to? Is that you as the owner in the green box in the middle, or is that their leadership chain? These things need to be clearly articulated. And if again you think of it from an own perspective, it really helps to have them clearly articulated, because it helps speed things up. Right? So it helps speed up the decision-making progress. People don't kind of sit there and say, well, I'm kind of paralyzed right now. I don't know how to make forward progress. So this is very difficult to do. And I'm not saying I or my team, we always do a perfect job at this, but it's definitely something that I strive towards, having good clarity on that. Which leads me to clearly communicating status. How do we get everybody, keep everybody informed? In our hypothetical scenario, we had 4 VPs. How do you make sure that they understand the project, they understand what's going on, they understand the long poles? In my experience, when VPs call for these kinds of reviews, one of the reasons is that they not only want to know the status, or they want to, communicate their expectations. It's also because they need to know, where can I help, right? What do you need from me? So that's where all of this communication, again, just because it's such a complex thing, becomes more and more important. And then finally, fail fast. And this is one of my biggest things. one of the failure modes that I've seen in these complex projects is that they are really truly too complex for any one person to fully understand and get their head around, right? And so what I've seen sometimes, so you definitely have people that can get their head around the entire project, but not every single design detail and every system that is somehow involved or gets invoked or gets called, right? And so what I've seen is that sometimes you get into these situations where the team is like, okay, I'm designing something, and then somebody's like, well, but what about this other thing? Don't we need to handle that too? Yes, we need to handle that too. And then kind of the scope increases, and then you end up kind of in this vicious cycle of where like, and then there's just these 10 other things we need to figure out. And so as a result, it's actually very difficult to make forward progress, right? So in my view, we really need to, when we have these really complex things, we really need to split them into multiple pieces, have multiple pieces owned by different people that are very close to the very tight on scope creep. So I will just very briefly touch on how to avoid those failure modes. Again, I already touched on quite a bit of this, but when I say here single points of failure, my belief is that in complex human systems and computer systems arguably as well, you actually have a higher risk of a single point of failure because we specialize more, right? You get some engineer in team X, and they know very deeply their area, but maybe because the system is pretty big and broad, they don't understand everything, right? And so it's actually I've been certainly in situations over the course of my career where we worked in complex projects and we had single points of failure. And one technique that I have learned is that it's actually really useful to have multiple people that can articulate the entirety of the program. So maybe they lead a review, or they can write a short summary of the entirety of the program, and have that not just be one person for that very reason. Don't always say yes. I have said it before, I will say it again, beware of scope creep. Scope creep can lead to analysis paralysis, and so you're kind of going in circles, and every other day somebody shows up and say, oh, but what about this? And you're like, okay, now I have to fold this into my design as well. I have to start from scratch. It can lead to us not making progress. And then finally, as I said with individual ownership, I will say that again here, have a system. And what strikes me is that there's an entire industry, there's an entire profession built around this technical program management, right? I have found that for these complex programs, this is actually really critical to just have very good clarity on how this program is run, as I've already said. Sometimes managers fill the TPM gaps, not always as well, because TPM is a profession for a reason, and they're really good at what they do. But thinking of this from a program perspective, if you have a complex project like that, is really important. And also making sure that all the disciplines are considered, like dev, testing, product management, and so forth. I often find myself pulling all of them in so that we don't have blind spots and we don't get surprised further down the road. So I want to spend a couple of minutes just reflecting on all the things that I've talked about over the last 44 minutes. When you think about individual ownership, we talked a lot about a lot of different things, but let me just draw your attention to the top thing here. Do less, but do it well. It's really important to be very thoughtful about the things that we do, but then really do them well and knock them out of the park and set great expectations, set great status, communicate great status, and do it really, really well. That's really what I try to do. Not always well, but that is certainly my goal. But I can't do everything because then I just peanut butter myself. When we talk about team ownership, again, let me draw your attention to the top item here. be the one who picks up the slack, which I know may stand very much in contrast with what I just said on the previous slide. But think about everything that your team delivers from a team's perspective and where can you have the most impact, right? To the team. How do you help out the team for the team to deliver impact? And so if you think about it from that perspective, then it's actually not in contrast with what I said before. It's really important that we, at least, it's really important that we always look at what does the team need in order to show up as an owner for the company and deliver the impact that this team needs to deliver for the company. Same thing. And then finally, in terms of org ownership, again, let me draw your attention to the top item here. Play with this analogy of being a homeowner. Maybe it'll work for you. It works for me. It works for some of the people I work with. And yes, you don't have everything under control. And I've heard VPs say the more senior you get, the less you have under your control. And I can see where they're coming from. And it's really, maybe you don't control everything, but you're still accountable. That's the key here. Let me just conclude with one thing that is important to me is it's important to have compassion and self-compassion. So self-compassion means be patient with yourself. I've said now probably 10 times in this talk that I'm not perfect at holding up my own expectations here or living up to my own expectations. But it's important that I hold myself to very high standards, but I also understand that I'm human and I can't do everything as much as I would love to. I can't do everything. I make mistakes. I need to learn from them. And I need to have some, amount of compassion with myself. And importantly, that really applies to others as well. And that's where I feel like sometimes we don't do enough either, right? Is we hold other people to a standard that is very, very high, and we don't always appreciate the pressures that other people are under. This is, of course, especially true in 2020 with COVID and everything else. But I think having a certain, like, coming into these conversations with the attitude that these people are humans too, and they make mistakes, and hopefully they will try to learn from them, and they're under tremendous amount of pressure too, while still holding them accountable and saying, I understand you're under pressure, but like, how can we, communicate better, or how can we learn from this, and so forth. So a little bit of compassionate self-compassion, I think, will go a long way for all of us. And with that, I will thank you for taking the time to listen. I would love to get your feedback. I would love to get your questions. And I'm always open to hearing other people's experiences and what they have learned.
Thank you, Catherine. That was a lot of great advice, especially as you mentioned in this kind of virtual world we've been living in. So we'll be taking questions now. I'll go ahead and I'll pull one of them up here. Have you applied any approaches to proactively identify single points of failures within your teams?
That's a great question. So I would admit that, oftentimes we find single points of failures a little bit reactively. We have, when we do planning, that comes up a lot, right? So when we do planning for the semester, for instance, we assign people to tasks, and we are thoughtful about how, if we just say you do this, you do this, you do this, then that creates problems, as we've seen for single points of failure. So we do try to do our best to pod people up. One of the things that we do at Google is we do code reviews for everything. So it's important that that people review each other's code. And one of the things that we've done, so I had one team that had an issue with single points of failure. And one of the things that we did is we said, okay, we want to make sure that this particular area has 3 people that understand it pretty well. And so there's one person who's already working on it, and then there are 2 others who we want to, kind of ramp up on this area. So this one person who was already working on it was kind of spreading their code reviews over the entire team, but we decided we were going to be much more thoughtful and say, no, all the reviews go to these two people, and they get, over time, they get tasks assigned and so forth. So we basically split up the entire team, and every person was kind of assigned to multiple areas so that they would over time ramp up on them. That's one approach we did. To be perfectly honest, it was still a little reactive because we reacted to perceiving that there were single points of failure. But
yeah, code reviews are a great example. I always feel like that highlights a lot of times when you mention kind of the bottlenecks or parts of flow that make it hard.
Oh yeah, they're really easy to spot that way. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What advice do you have on improving accountability with an owner when a dependency fails? And then in parentheses, avoiding blame.
I think the question is asking, if I want to deliver something, but I have a dependent team and they don't deliver, is that right? And they fall behind?
That's how I think so, yes.
Okay. There's no magic, right? Like, and I'm not the kind of person that will now go and publicly shame people. I don't believe in that. But what I do a lot is, we get together a lot. Like, I have several projects that I'm involved in that involve many, many teams. And so spotting these, my goal is always to try to sniff out the places that would be problems, that will be problems in a month or two, right? So I always try to pay attention to those areas where I'm like, okay, it was green and now it's kind of yellow, and we're starting to worry, and we found an issue we don't quite yet know. And then, they will come back, my team or some other team will come back and say, no, we've got it, it's under control. And I'm like, oh, okay, all right, so let's keep an eye on it. And so I just try to be on top of it very early, and then highlight. Oftentimes what I find is that people don't fail to deliver because they're lazy or they want to twiddle their thumbs or whatever. It's always something else, right? So it's always that they underestimate the complexity, right? And they missed something. So then if that's the problem and I see kind of a pattern of that, then, I will ask them, okay, let's dive in. I ask more questions. What's your test plan? What's your rollback plan? What are your dependencies and so forth. The other thing that happens a lot is that people are just like, some teams are understaffed and they're just pulled in many different directions. And that, again, can be for a number of reasons why they maybe deprioritized what I needed. But I think setting the context of what we're trying to do in this project is really important there. And if they're still understaffed, then I would just say, okay, what does it mean? Like, if you're not going to deliver this, what does this mean for the timeline of the entire project? And then I understand that you cannot deliver this because you have all of these fires that you need to put out. Let's go to our leadership and highlight that and ask them for help, right? Because they have skin in the game too, and they only succeed if we succeed. And so maybe they have funding that they can apply, or maybe they can help us deprioritize something else. Does that make sense?
Yes,
So
I think so.
I don't let people off the hook, I think.
Yeah, I think it definitely makes sense too, just as you mentioned, how best to communicate it. And I know a lot of times it's a big focus on avoiding blames. That makes sense to me. Our next question is around kind of unplanned work. So how does your team deal with the interruption of planned work with defects? So maybe this one is like specifically defects that result in a downtime. So
yes.
that maybe that prioritization type item you brought up.
Yeah. So one of the things that I've, and I used to lead SRE teams too, and now I lead more like dev side teams. But in either case, those things happen. Failures, and we have to try really hard to avoid them, but they do happen. And then you may know this, but at Google we always do a blameless postmortem where we kind of write up what happened and we write down the action items. And I think what the question is getting at here is, how do you balance the action items from this defect or from this postmortem with all the other stuff you've already committed to, right? My belief is there's no one size fits all answer, but there are some things that I have seen work. So one of the things that we do is we always set aside some time for unplanned work, right? If we don't, then we can make even faster progress on the things that we committed to. But sometimes we need it, right? And sometimes it's not even enough. And you see that too, that we have kind of these follow-up items from a post-mortem, from a defect or an outage. And we have our project work and we need to balance the two. And then sometimes it comes to a prioritization exercise in the moment, right? Where we say, well, we have to delay this and communicate that because this is so critical. So setting aside time at the beginning of the semester or whatever your planning period is, and basically have like a band going, a time allotment going through. And then the second thing is, if that's not good enough, then it becomes a prioritization exercise. Sadly.
Yeah. Okay. This next question is maybe a little bit on the clean APIs or guarantees is around documentation. Documentation is often an afterthought, yet is essential for downstream organizations such as support or an organization which could have high turnover when trying to work through issues. What gateways have you seen work well to be in place to ensure documentation and knowledge transfers occur? And I believe these items help aid in reducing single points of failure or single ownership by growing the team.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I do agree that this often comes as an afterthought, especially, it's, an engineer builds something and then after it's built, now they're supposed to write up how it works and so forth. So the best advice I would have, and, I would give is, also set aside time for that right from the beginning. Just like we have to plan for testing, we have to plan for thorough production or a slow production rollout. We also have to plan time for documentation for this reason. I worked on a team once that had a big issue with this, and they got themselves into a place where they essentially had ongoing office hours every day, right? I mean, it was like a chat room basically. And it got to a point where there was one engineer at all times. It was a rotation, right? They would take 1 week shifts and they would spend all day answering questions. And I can tell you that there's no better motivation for engineers to write documentation than something like this. That's obviously what you try to avoid getting to, but that is one way of dealing with it if you're already in a bad situation and support is like struggling, for instance, to know what to tell the customers and things like that.
Okay. Well, I think we're almost to the top of the hour. So I want to thank you again, Katharina, for joining us. You shared a lot of great reminders on how we can best operate within our teams. Again, especially when there's so much asynchronous communication or things like that today with the virtual world. So this concludes today's Tech Talk. Thank you again for joining, and look for this recording to be available in the coming days on our YouTube playlist. Take care, everybody.
Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.